we call it the Vultee vibrator. I forget the number, but it was a terrible plane. It was underpowered. It had fixed landing gear. Looked a lot like the AT-6, but they had we were restricted from doing acrobatics in those planes because the tail would fall off. And they had certain planes where if we had to have an acrobatic checkout, that was the plane that you had to go out and do it in, because they were making sure that the tails were beefed up and ready to handle this thing. And another story I've told you about getting airsick when we were in the Piper Cubs. I had one flight I had to have a check ride for acrobatics, and this was with AT-6s, which is the advanced trainer. In other words, PT, and then the BT, and then the AT, the advanced trainer. We went up and we had to do certain prescribed acrobatics, with emblements and rolls and loops and all kinds of, and big lazy S's and so forth. And I got sick as a dog doing those acrobatics. And when we got back down, I said, boy, my instructor said, that was the greatest acrobatic check ride I've ever had. He was sick as he could be. So, you had to deal with it, and so it's just part of it. For me, it was, although I never had trouble much after that. It did settle down. But I guess you asked about the trains and planes, and then from the basic trainer, which was that Vultee vibrator, and then the AT-6, which was a nice little plane. I still use them a lot. They had the undercarriage would fold up, and it had nice power, and just a neat little plane. And that I had an experience with that one time. We went on night cross country out of Mission Field in Texas, and we were to fly up to, I forget where, but in, a big triangular shape at night. Well, as soon after I took off, I was looking back to orient myself to the field, and my goggles flew off. I had, the goggles on there. I looked back like that, and it caught it. And so I couldn't hear, I had no way to communicate. I could talk, but I couldn't. So I called the field and told them, I said, but I'm going on anyway. And of course they had no way to tell me not to do it. And I'm told later that they sent the next guy out to get me. And I don't know what he was supposed to do, shoot me down or something, but he never got to me. So I flew this big triangular course. And it was, I don't know, it must have been a 2 hours or more in flight, so you had to hit these points. And I went to where I thought I was supposed to go, and I went down, and then my estimated time of arrival came when I was supposed to be back to, it was Moore Field at Mission, Texas. And, but there was no field there. So there's nothing, and Texas there's a whole lot of nothing out there, so it was what in the world? So I looked way off to the left, which was Mexico, because this is Mission, Texas is pretty close to the border. And I saw the lights of a field. I said, well, there's a Mexican airfield there. I'll go to that because I don't have any place else to go. So I went down to it, and of course it was more field. So I landed. Boy, did they ever get on me about that one. but I made it, and I guess they figured if I could do it without being able to have communication, I was do all right. But that sort of, a lot of that sort of thing happened. And sometimes, it doesn't work out. I was just lucky because that could have been fatal, or at least, bail out somewhere and have to walk back, that sort of thing, and then wash out. Anyway, after we went through those planes and graduated and got our wings, then we were assigned to fly P-47s, which was a disappointment at the time because we all wanted to be in P-51s because they are the pretty plane. And the P-47 is an ugly plane. I've got them up here. I don't know whether you can see them, but the 51 is snappy and pretty and all that. But I tell you, after having flown both of them, if I choose the 47, I'm glad I was in it because when they're shooting at you, it's the plane to be in because the 51 could not absorb the damage that a 47 can by any means. You can shoot down a 51 with a 22, but you got to hit a 47 an awful lot of times to knock it down. And there are stories I can tell you about that.
Before we get to those, were you in the P-40 prior to the P-47?
Yeah, we just had that for training purposes.
Okay.
That was I forget, they call it transition training, I think, as I recall. And that was after we had graduated and we had gotten our wings, and the first plane we flew was the P-40, just briefly. And I tell you, it was the hardest plane of the three to fly by a long shot. And I've often thought about those poor guys that flew that thing a lot because it was, I don't know whether you know what torque is and how it affects an airplane. But the plane, when you're climbing, and I'll get this wrong, but anyway, you got to step on one rudder as hard as you can in a 40 to offset the plane's, the torque of the plane, and then you got to step on it as hard as you can when you're diving to offset the torque. The other planes had better trim tabs, and you could trim it out so that you could, crank a little crank, and it would offset the pressure that was required to offset the feeling of torque. And you're never really flying, well, you are, but many times you're not flying straight and level. And if you're diving or climbing, you've got to offset that torque. And those P-40 pilots must have developed tremendous leg muscles because it really required effort. And then another problem with the 40 was its narrow landing gear. And you had to, it was kind of tricky to get that thing down. But in the 47, the landing gear was way out here. And the 51, the landing gear was pretty wide also. And so it was a harder plane to fly, and that's the one they put us in for the transition, which is another one of those goofy things that don't always make too much sense. But they were the earlier planes, and they were available, and I don't know, but it was much easier to fly the 47 and the 51. And the 47, the easiest of all, because you could land them, drop them in from way up. And there's another story about that, but you could drop them, and they could withstand the shock better. But we had I could go on forever with these stories, but we had a long distance flight one time in P-47s. We flew up, we were flying to Minneapolis and across into Denver, I believe, and then back down to our field in where were we? Anyway, doesn't matter, down in Kansas, Wichita. But we weren't going to stop. We were going to fly and then land back at our home base. So we just had on our summer uniforms. Well, by the time we got up to Minneapolis, one of the pilots one of the trainees had gotten his spark plugs fouled up to such an extent that we had to land. So we landed on this civilian field. And it was a field that we didn't know had it was broad until about halfway down, and then it dropped off, and it was half as wide again. And so, in our tradition, our routine was one plane would land here, and another one here, and another one here, and another one here. So that second plane would be faced with a very short runway, and so it was a tricky business, but we managed to get all 4 planes in. There were 4 of them, and then we had to stay there in Minneapolis overnight, but we didn't have any clothes. I thought I was going to freeze to death. It was the dead of winter, and we were going to before I could get back into the hangar. And so we did that, and then we stayed overnight, and our instructor wanted me to fly the other fellow's plane back. Well, I guess he didn't trust him, and didn't know the way he could find his way home, you know. So I said, so I tried to get these other guys, because we were in a dry state. And I must confess that occasionally it seemed appropriate for us to have a drink once in a while. And I tried to get these guys to pick up some booze, because we were in the middle of both states were dry. So they wouldn't do it. But I got a case of all things Lord Calvert, and it was a terrible kind of bourbon. And I finally found a place to put it in the plane, because they had these little panels you could take off, and I put them back there, kind of sitting on the control wires back there. And so I put it back there, and the rest left, and I had to wait for the plane to be fixed. And when they did, I took off, and was of course it seemed appropriate to me to buzz the countryside. You know, chase farmers or whatever, you know, and that sort of thing. And so I was doing that. Oh, I'm sorry, but I have to back up a little bit, because on the test ride, I took this plane up. This was before I loaded it up for the booze run, to test it out. And the man had burned all the gasoline out of one. We had tanks, wing tanks, you know, as well as one behind the seat. And he burned all the gasoline out of one side. And I didn't know that. There wasn't any way to tell, as I recall. Anyway, so I was trying to test it, but there was a low cloud cover, very low. We were very, you know, up there in Minneapolis, nothing but lakes and everything. But anyway, I was flying along very carefully and very slow. And this guy in a AT-6 jumped me and wanted to dogfight. And I don't know where he came from, but there must have been a little military base there somewhere. But I couldn't do anything at that altitude with this plane that was. So anyway, I came back around and to land. And our traditional pattern was to come in. We're supposed to be at 1,000 feet. We normally made it at 500, and then you kick it around in a very tight 360, and where you broke off about right over the end of the runway, when the runway is out here, and you come back around like that, and just, you know, it's kind of and of course the tighter the turn, the hotter the pilot, the tighter the turn. So that was a matter of pride. So I was pulling one of those things, and this plane. Then I found out that one of the tanks was empty practically, and that plane was out of balance, and it almost flipped on me. And of course that would have been the end of this story. But I was able to ride it, and came back around and fighting the thing all the way, and came in and landed, and it was the worst landing I ever made. Although they say that any landing you can walk away from is a good landing, so it was a good landing in that sense. But boy, that's the only way. It was terrible. And I dropped it in and went boom like this, and I got taxied back to the hangar, and I heard these guys say, "Did you see that landing that P-47 made?" You know, boy, I had to slink out of there. But anyway, I was going back, and then when I took off and was flying back to Kansas, I ran out of gas in one of those tanks. That tank that, I hadn't known why, but I put it all together later, what was wrong with that plane. And there's a switch down here that you can switch, and I used to keep my knuckles skinned up, because if you left it a split second too long, it would take quite a while for it to catch up again. And I was right on the deck, and I didn't have that split second. So I, hit it like that, and the plane sputtered, and I thought, boy, I can see the headline now. P-47 spread all over the countryside in Minnesota with large Calvert bottles all over the place. So anyway, I made it back, and it's stuff like that just in the normal routine, and because of youthful craziness, it was dangerous stuff, because that could have been it right there.